we're also hearing about an attack on a command and control, command and control node, which again, actually, it's from a military perspective, if you cut off the communications, cut off the direction, we know that the Russian troops on the front line are all very poorly trained, desperate morale. And if they're getting no orders and being told what to do, then that is a rabble. And that's what Ukraine wants. They want this Russian force to turn into a rabble. And the fact that Putin over the weekend has been screaming about nuclear attack yet again, saying that Europe is defenseless, to me is really showing how concerned that he is getting hit, that actually, and we also heard him talking about ceasefires and peace talks sort of 10 days ago, that actually the special military operation might be about to crumble.
Hello and welcome to Frontline from TimesRadio. I'm Alex Dibble, Times Radio's Deputy Head of News. Today on Frontline, we're joined by former British Army officer Hamish De Bretton-Gordon, a former commander of the Royal Tank Regiment and the UK's Joint Chemical, Biological and Nuclear Regiment. Hamish has served on operations during the First Gulf War in Cyprus, Kosovo, Iraq, Afghanistan, and he regularly contributes to Frontline and to Times Radio. Hamish, thank you very much indeed for your time.
Pleasure. Thanks for having me.
I thought we could start by talking about some developments in the last few days. Ukraine carrying out several strikes on Russia, most notably using another long-range drone to destroy a Russian fighter jet. How big a blow do you think that will be to Russia and indeed the war effort?
Well, I think these events over the last few days are hugely significant. The 1,000-mile front line has been, fairly static, although the Russians have been making some significant gains. And, really for the last year or perhaps 2 years, Ukraine has almost been fighting with one hand behind its back because it hasn't had the ability to actually, or permission is probably the wrong word, to strike into Russia itself. That has been discouraged by the Allies. And until really a few days ago, the US has not allowed its precision-guided weaponry to be used to do that. Now that all NATO countries who are supporting Ukraine have really given the go-ahead, it is potentially going to tip the balance. And some of the attacks over the last few days are absolutely saying that. Now, the attack on the stealth, the most modern, sophisticated Russian fighter, the Su-57, that is in the media at the moment, is, on the face of it, lose one fighter, sort of so what? But from a morale perspective, for the Ukrainians, it's fantastic. And for the Russians, it's a severe blow. This is the fighter that fires the hypersonic missiles that are doing so much damage. It's supposed to be completely immune to anything, but actually, a drone has taken it out. Now, I think what else is important, and it's an open secret, that the Ukrainians are getting an awful lot of intelligence for this targeting from NATO, from predominantly, I expect, the US and the UK. So that is having a huge impact. We're also hearing about an attack on a command and control, command and control node, which again, actually, it's from a military perspective, if you cut off the communications, cut off the direction, we know that the Russian troops on the front line are all very poorly trained, desperate morale. And if they're getting no orders and being told what to do, then that is a rabble. And that's what Ukraine wants. They want this Russian force to turn into a rabble. So in order to do that and attack, up to 400 kilometers into Russia, I think that swung the balance. And let's face it, Russia has not been hamstrung by this. They can attack from anywhere. So, yeah, I think this might be that we might be on the top of the tide, as it were, and it could be significant. And the fact that Putin over the weekend has been screaming about nuclear attack yet again, saying that Europe is defenseless, to me is is really showing how concerned that he is getting hit. That actually, and we also heard him talking about ceasefires and peace talks, sort of 10 days ago. That actually the special military operation might be about to crumble.
Well, we can go into a number of the things you mentioned in more detail over our conversation, but you mentioned there that the attack on the command node, the Russian command node, that was directly hit by Ukraine. You talked about morale based on your experience on the ground serving in the armed forces. If you were a commander or indeed a soldier, and you have one of your command nodes being directly hit, what does that do to yourself, what you're feeling and what you're thinking, but also your unit and the wider army that you have in that area?
Well, it's rather bizarre. I expect some of the Russian soldiers are probably delighted because of the cruelty and brutality that's handed out by their commanders. But I think also from a morale side, if somebody is taking out your key areas way behind you, with such precision, then you're starting to realise, and I expect all the rubbish that these troops are fed from their commanders, that they're invincible, and the Ukrainians are just some sort of second-rate military. Well, you start to realise that is not the case, and morale is everything in warfare. It's that to get out, fighting is a terrible game. It's terrifying, but in order to do it effectively, you need to want to do it. You need that morale. So I think, again, adding to other things, yeah, it could be very significant. And yeah, it could break whatever fragile morale those troops have. Because they know that if the generals can be taken out so easily, what hope have they got? So yeah, I think it's a big time, big issue.
Mm. This isn't the first time Ukraine has been able to inflict this sort of blow on Russia. Something that not comes out of nowhere, that would be the wrong way to put it, but something that definitely makes you step back and say, "Wow, that's impressive." Do you think that it again demonstrates how Ukraine are able to develop drone technology in warfare? I mean, in the last couple of years in this conflict, we've seen the technology develop and move because it has to, and it has to quickly. But again, do you think they're pushing the boundaries of drone warfare?
Very much so. I mean, I think for those of us military observers, the evolution of the drone warfare, as you rightly call it, has been incredible, fascinating. When I was last on operations in Afghanistan, probably 10 years ago, drones were just coming in. We were using them in onesies and twosies, and it was a big deal. Now Ukraine is using thousands, tens of thousands of drones for a whole host of things. And the fact that a drone can go, 400 miles into Russia, and destroy a multi-million pound aircraft like an Su-57 is incredible. But when one is a little bit more forensic about it, the way that drones are used on the front line in mass, and what we're learning also about Ukraine is mass still has a real value. And the mass of drones, and a lot of these drones are, $500 a pop type of thing, but they still need quite sophisticated weaponry to take them out. There was a lot of criticism about, the Brits and others using, multi-million-dollar missiles to take out, Russian or Houthi forces. But actually, that is the issue, and that's what we're learning about drones. And I think the Ukrainians are incredibly resilient and incredibly imaginative the way that they use these things. I was a tank commander for many years, and we're seeing the majority of Russian tanks being taken out by a $500 drone that drops a $200 hand grenade through an open hatch. I mean, that is just phenomenal. And the key thing is you get overwhelmed by them, and if you can have overwhelming drone force, then then you can make progress. And it's something that we need to really get hold of in the British military, because at the moment we have a few very expensive drones. We lose one of those, you lose a tremendous capability. But if you have thousands of these things, and I think people who've seen these sort of drone dances in the air, at fireworks thing and all the rest of it, will get an idea of quite how capable these things are now. And if you use them on the battlefield like the Ukrainians, you can make up. It's very clear that Ukraine hasn't got the numbers of tanks, or numbers of soldiers, numbers of everything else that the Russians have got, but they do have drones en masse. And although the Russians are using drones as well, they don't seem to be quite so sophisticated. And the Russians like to use what I call their mark pieces of equipment, their Su-57s, the hypersonic missiles and all that sort of stuff. That's all very good and flashy, but actually, it's a piece that I wrote with the historian James Holland the other day in the Telegraph was saying, we have been so seduced by technology that we've forgotten about mass, and actually quantity has a real quality of its own. And I think that's where the Ukrainians have really taken the drone capability in a military perspective to the next level and been hugely effective with it.
And as Russia has responded to that increased use of drones by Ukraine, is there any danger, do you think, that the West, which of course has a huge stake and is supplying Ukraine with weaponry, that the West is almost being left behind by Russia's development with regard to anti-drone warfare and drone warfare, should in 5-10 years or however many we think it might be, that there's actually a conflict between the West and Russia?
That's a really good point. I would like to say no, and I think I'm right, actually. I know that both the Brits, the British, and the Americans are looking very, very closely at what's happening in Ukraine, and without one won't go break any state secrets, but they will be seeing all this. The MOD announced the other day that Porton Down, the defence laboratory, had developed a new weapon called Dragonfire, which is sort of an electromagnetic laser that shoots down drones, at sort of £10 a shot, and which is the sort of capability that you need. So I think they're looking very closely, and of course, hopefully, they'll be nicking is probably the wrong word, but seeing what the Russians are doing and taking the good stuff. So I think as we sit on the sidelines, as it were, and try and give the Ukrainians everything to do the fighting, I think we're also probably learning a lot. I mean, in warfare, things evolve very quickly, but if you can learn at your enemy's expense, then all the better. So I am relatively confident that actually we're staying up to the piece. Now, the real issue here is whether we, and let's look at Britain, whether we are going to develop our military and invest in it from what we're learning in Ukraine, because the strategic defense review a few years ago that has given us the military we've got at the moment is against a concept, is against a battle, and it is against an enemy that simply doesn't exist now. So what we need desperately is a defense review so that we can get into the counter drone warfare, get into the mass and learn, because if we have to fight the Russians, and it is a possibility. It might be unlikely, but it is certainly a possibility. If Ukraine doesn't hold the Russians and they keep going, nobody who looks at this in any detail thinks the Russians will stop at Ukraine. Then, the minute they go further west than Ukraine, we're into a NATO war. And we've got to prepare for that. And I know people have been talking about we're in a pre-war period. We certainly are. But the way to prevent the war is to prepare for it. And if I was Putin looking at the British military now, I would not think that we were preparing for war. And that would encourage me. So whoever is in number 10 come the 5th of July, I think they need to really get hold of our military and make sure that it's the conventional deterrence that will deter Putin. Because quite frankly, any other threat we're thinking about at the moment, I think is irrelevant in the next 10 years. It is Putin, it is Russia that we need to defend against.
Lessons, I'm sure, for the whole of NATO, not just the UK.
Absolutely.
Going back a few minutes, you were talking about comments made by Vladimir Putin that Europe is defenseless to a nuclear conflict with Russia. He made those comments at the St. Petersburg Economic Forum. The latest of many nuclear threats from Vladimir Putin and from the Kremlin. But is there truth in this, that NATO and Europe would struggle to stop or deter Putin if the war in Ukraine does spill over?
No, absolutely not. I think the whole nuclear issue, which of course Putin and his sort of gangsters who are around him are trying to pour as much fuel on that issue as possible, because so many, particularly a lot of the European leaders, appear to be petrified by the nuclear issue. Particularly those countries who don't have nuclear weapons themselves. And I think it is complete bluff and bluster. Putin was saying they're defenseless, saying he's going to use tactical nuclear weapons. Well, I've said this often and written about it often, that this is just not going to happen. And I think, really importantly, what we've seen with Ukraine being given the ability to use sophisticated American and British missiles to strike into Russia has made that completely unworkable, because Russia's tactical nuclear weapons are on what's called Iskander missiles, and these are on big trucks. And they're also put on aircraft like Su-57s. Now, those missiles need to only have a range of 400 kilometers. They need to be on the Ukraine border to fire them. Now, with all the intelligence that we're hoovering up, I expect the Ukrainians would have at least several hours, if not a day or so, of information of this. So they now have the ability to take out the Russian nuclear launchers themselves, and the same with the aircraft. So I think it is a complete irrelevance, and Putin knows that, and I think that's why he was so verbose and demonstrative at the weekend on this particular issue, because I think he sort of feels that things are running through his hands. He's losing his grip. But maybe if he can get some of the softer members of Parliament in Europe to keep worrying about it, then that's a chance. But I think it's very important that people, not only in this country but across Europe, understand. In my opinion, and I've been looking at this a heck of a lot over the years, I think the Russian tactical nuclear deterrent is completely unusable.
And do you think it's significant, therefore, that comments from the Kremlin, from Vladimir Putin himself, around this issue have come about in a time when we've seen the US say to Ukraine, okay, we're going to give you the green light to use in a limited capacity some of our weaponry to strike targets inside Russia, and that the comments from the Kremlin have sort of arisen out of that context?
I think absolutely, because if Putin can convince European NATO leaders that this is going to lead to escalation, then then that's for him good, because he knows that that's the last thing people want. But actually, he's done nothing. So we know for the last 4 weeks and over the last few days, Ukraine has been using Russian British missiles to take out targets in Russia. What has happened? Putin has, more hot air is coming out of the Kremlin and him in St. Petersburg, but nothing actually is happening. And it's been the same for the last, since the 24th of February 2022, when he and some of his other lapdogs have been shouting the nuclear issue. Nothing has happened. There has been no escalation in over 2 years. So again, I just hope that Western leaders and our own politicians realize this and make decisions on the basis that I've said is his nuclear capability is unusable, rather than assume that it is. Assume that it isn't, and we'll be in a much better place, because, as I've said, I think the front lines are in the balance at the moment, but the balance is shifting very much towards Ukraine with ability to strike into Russia. And again, with warfare, we've talked about morale. Once you start to get a bit of momentum, then things are huge. And the other issue that is significant is what we call the air war. So the sea war, Ukraine has won. The Black Sea Fleet has disappeared. So Ukraine has freedom of maneuver in the sea. On the ground, they need air power to have freedom of maneuver on the ground. If they get freedom of maneuver, the Ukrainians, that is, they can punch through those defenses. And apart from these missiles and the ability to strike into Russia, we know the F-16s are coming over the horizon. If Ukraine can dominate the air and get air superiority, even air parity, then they can start moving on the ground. So I think that's why I think this is also pivotal. This summer is key because we know with grand strategic things like potentially Trump coming into power, then that could change the American attitude. So in one way, I think Putin is trying to hold on until November because he thinks, Trump will be a bonus for him. But for the Ukrainians, and I think for NATO and ourselves, we've got to absolutely push as hard as we can. And now there is a glimmer of hope, reinforce success, get on with it. So, absolutely key the way things are moving. And I think Putin's rant at the weekend in St. Petersburg is somebody who's really worried. I think he realizes that, things are going south. They're not going his way. And there could be a chance that, he could be back where he started in 2014. And that would be the end of him.
You've spoken about the sea war, the land war, the air war. What about the information war? The United States has said today that it is going to operate a base in Poland, working with the Polish to counter disinformation from Russia and help Ukraine win the information war. Is that a war that an element of this conflict? Is that an element that we've almost forgotten and forgotten its significance?
Well, let's hope we haven't forgotten its significance because it's absolutely key. It's all about influencing the population. That's what, and the Russians, they are absolutely the masters of this. When we had the Salisbury attack, which is where I'm talking to you from at the moment, when the Russian sort of chemical attack, what Russia did really well was its disinformation. Every 24 hours, there were 60 bits of major sort of media pieces coming out of Russia and people associated with Russia to try and throw everybody off. And people started, believing it. And that's another thing about quantity. If you tell somebody something often enough, that they start to question, almost believe it. So I think the Russians, and there's so much of this stuff on Twitter and on X and social media that I know who the Russian bots and Twitterati are, but I think most of the population probably doesn't, and some of it is ridiculous, and some of it is very clever. So I think it's absolutely key. In the West, we've been, not very good at what I'd call the open counter disinformation. Now, an awful lot goes on in the shadows, but it's the stuff in the public domain, if you like, where the Russians really focus. And the challenge that we have in, let's say, in this country, to try and counter that disinformation for politicians and soldiers to put stuff out, it takes so long to get verified and checked, and every I crossed and T whatever, that by the time it comes out, it's past its sell-by date. It's very difficult. Social media and disinformation is instantaneous, and there's so much of it. But unless you can be instantaneous with your counter, then you completely lose it. So the fact that the Americans again set up in Poland and be closer to the action, if it were, is a really good thing. But I think you're absolutely right. We've probably forgotten about this, and people are not focusing on it. But everybody who consumes social media is getting Russian disinformation and propaganda all the time, and I expect most of the time they don't realize it.
Perhaps one element of the conflict, which again may have gone under the radar, if you forgive the pun, has been the use of particular weapons by Russia, in this case CS gas. What's your concern about the way Russia is using it, but also the way Ukraine is able to defend itself, but also defend its individual soldiers and individual military personnel?
Yeah, this is absolutely key, and I don't think it's got the coverage that perhaps it should. And part of my military career, I was responsible for chemical defence, and I also spent a time as the Peshmerga's chemical weapons advisor for 2 years in the fight with Islamic State, because these are dreadful weapons that have a massive psychological impact as well as a physical one. And the Russians, if one's completely dispassionate about it, have been pretty clever. They've used riot control agents, CS gas, to great effect, because what they've done is they've dropped these gas canisters into the front line, and not occasionally, but we're talking thousands of times. The Ukrainians produced a report to the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, which is the UN watchdog who look after this, at Christmas last year, detailing 600 events. I did a study with the Telegraph, with Jimmy Rushton, and Reuters did as well a few weeks ago, and we identified thousands of uses. In fact, I've spoken to people on the front line who say, "Yeah, it's in the morning and the evening." It's unbelievable, but it's so effective, because the most of the soldiers on the front line, if they have a gas mask, it's an old Soviet one, and although riot control agents, don't kill you, you actually need a really good filter on your respirator to be able to counter them. So, because they have no respirators, what it's doing is they're getting out of the trenches where they're then, attacked by the Russians. And CS gas sort of incapacitates you for about 5 to 10 minutes, which is enough time. And the Ukrainians have lost a lot of ground because of this. But there's a very simple way to counter it: is give them good gas masks, Western gas masks. And bizarrely, Britain is the premier producer of gas masks in the world. We provide all the Americans all their gas masks, the British military all their gas masks, and NATO all its gas masks. So actually, it's something that Britain could relatively easily sort out. These things. Admittedly, they probably need a few of them. 100,000 or so. I don't know what the figures are, but the cost is in the millions, maybe. I don't know, but it's not like it's not like a missile that costs 2 million quid each. So it's something, but it's not it's not the sort of bombs and bullets. The people on the front line really want them, but unfortunately, when people are back in Kyiv or whatever asking ourselves and the Americans for stuff, it's all about the sophisticated weaponry. But actually, something like a gas mask will have the same impact. It'll mean that those soldiers can stay where they are and fight. And on the legalistic perspective, actually, it is a war crime. Although it is a riot control agent under the Chemical Weapons Convention, it's viewed as a chemical weapons, and to use it in warfare is illegal. So, this is something else for the International Criminal Court to issue a arrest warrant for Putin again. And I think it's something that can be solved. And the thought, people sort of at the beginning of the war thought the Russians might use some sophisticated chemical weapons like Novichok, but they know they don't need to. Even a riot control agent is just as effective. And the fact that I have been writing in the press and doing interviews like this, that people don't realise it's against the Geneva Convention, the Chemical Weapons Convention, is the reason that Russians are exploiting it. Because they think, no, it's you use it in Europe all the time to sort your riots out. I'm just using it in warfare to try and defend ourselves against the Ukrainians, sort of thing. So yeah, it's significant. We can sort it out, and certainly something I've been lobbying various ministries in this country and elsewhere to sort it out. We shall see.
Well, despite what is happening with regard to CS gas, it seems from what you've been saying that at least you do have some optimism with regard, when you look at the conflict in general, that there's a route forward, at least through this summer perhaps and beyond for Ukraine. So that's promising. Hamish, thank you indeed for your time. It's been great to get your analysis again. We really appreciate your time on Frontline. Thank you.
That's a pleasure. Thanks very much for having me.
Thank you for watching Frontline from Times Radio, the interview series bringing you expert analysis on the world's conflicts, particularly the war in Ukraine. For more, you can listen to Times Radio. You can also go to the Times website, take out a digital subscription, and have access to all the reporting done by our foreign correspondents in Ukraine and indeed elsewhere around the world. And also listen to the Times' World in 10 podcast every day. We take you through the latest developments all in 10 minutes. That's the Times' World in 10 podcast. Thank you very much indeed again for watching Frontline from Times Radio.